5 members of the far-right militant group Proud Boys are suing the U.S. government now in connection with the January 6 attack on the Capitol. They were prosecuted for their role in the 2021 attack. 4 of the men were convicted of seditious conspiracy for participating in that riot, which, as you remember, tried to stop Congress from certifying the 2020 election.
USA! USA! I'm a Proud Boy. I'm a Proud Boy.
What does it mean to be a Proud Boy?
We're the villains for the left, and we're the heroes of the right.
When New Zealand designated the Proud Boys as a terrorist group in June 2022, it was one of the only countries in the world to do so. Stuff Circuit had revealed there were Proud Boys active in the country, Kiwi men aligning themselves to the far-right American group. Researchers tracked them as they posed with guns, posted anti-Muslim, racist and misogynistic views on social media, held gatherings and attended an anti-immigration rally in Auckland. Violent, anarchistic, sexist, far-right militant white supremacists. Why would you want them here? Well, we didn't. They have gone quiet, although they're probably still here. But now their terrorist designation has been lifted.
People who are inclined to associate, fund, participate, recruit for the Proud Boys can now do so without facing any legal consequence.
So, what's changed?
People think that we're a political group. We're not.
Extremists, neo-fascists, racists, misogynists, violent thugs. This is how you're perceived.
So when they call us neo-fascists, when they call us white supremacists, when they call us anything ism or isist, it's retarded. And I think that people are using it for propaganda.
Kia ora, I'm Amanda Gillies, and today on The Detail I speak to investigative journalist Paula Penfold, who's been keeping tabs on this group for several years now. Have they really turned over a new leaf?
So the Proud Boys are an extreme far-right group. They've been involved in acts of violence in the States. They were heavily involved in the insurrection of January 6. They have been organising in New Zealand, although they deny that that is the case. Now, the terrorist designation that they were given in 2022 has been allowed to expire, and we don't yet know the reasons for that to have been allowed to happen. We don't yet know whether the Proud Boys are still active in New Zealand, but we think it's pretty important that our authorities should find out.
So, who are the Proud Boys? When did they come to prominence and why? What is their influence in New Zealand? And did they inspire the March 15th terrorist in Christchurch?
So the American Proud Boys first came to attention, prominence in 2016 when their founder, Gavin McInnes, went public in a far-right publication in the States. And at that stage, he was describing them as Western chauvinists who, he said, refused to apologise for creating the modern world. They're difficult to define. And I think even the police in New Zealand, when they were setting out their statement of case, they took I think something like 29 pages, because part of that was really trying to define what the Proud Boys were. I think one of the easiest things to focus on when you're trying to offer up a definition is, while they don't have a single kind of ideological framework, one of the things that's really prominent is their support of violence, upholding violence against their opponents.
You just said Western chauvinists. What on earth does that mean?
That in itself is a really good question, Amanda. I mean, they don't necessarily define the idea of Western chauvinists themselves, but one thing that does come through quite clearly in their ideologies is their, aside from their white supremacy, is their misogyny. They view women as their preference for women is to have very traditional gendered roles, and their Western chauvinism fits with their idea of many of their beliefs of Western values being superior.
And the Proud Boys are big fans of US President Donald Trump, prompting their involvement in the January 6th riots on Capitol Hill in 2021. The court heard their leader prepared the assault over a number of weeks and then orchestrated and encouraged the violence on the day. It secured them global prominence.
Peace circle, breach the line. We need backup.
Absolutely, people are angry, and you can feel it. You can feel the rage, the madness.
Stop protecting tyrants! Stand down! USA! USA!
There'd been a bit of a build-up to the Capitol riots on January 6th. There had been multiple incidents of violence, usually around demonstrations, where the Proud Boys' method really is to target those who they see as opponents. They often try to argue that they're not promoting violence themselves, but they're being defensive against the violence that they try to portray others as carrying out. So there had been a focus on them, particularly at events, for example, Black Lives Matter protests in various cities around the states in the lead up to 2021. And then after Biden was elected, there was a whole lot of disinformation going on around whether there would be a peaceful transfer or whether there should be a peaceful transfer of power. The Proud Boys started organising. What they're known for doing is organising using really strategic encrypted methodology, really focused on organisation in an almost military kind of way. And so this was happening for a couple of days before January 6th, and it became, in the aftermath of that insurrection, that violence, it became one of the American justice system's biggest ever investigations into extremism, and many of the participants and leaders of the Proud Boys were arrested and incarcerated. One of them, the main leader, Enrico Tarrio, was sentenced to 22 years for sedition.
So that was 2021. By 2022, New Zealand had its own response to the Proud Boys, making world headlines.
Well, New Zealand has declared American far-right group, the Proud Boys, a terrorist entity. The group played a significant role in the storming of the US Capitol last year following Donald Trump's defeat in the presidential election. The decision on their terror status here was posted in the government's official journal of record, the Gazette, this week. It's the first time a US-based group has been added to our terrorist entities list.
Paula, how big was this, and sort of what did it mean for our country, for the Proud Boys, for the outlook of everything?
It was big. It's the first time that there had ever been the designation of a far-right extremist group as a terrorist entity. When the then Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern accepted the statement of case for the terrorist designation, the police said that they weren't aware of the Proud Boys operating in New Zealand, but they had acknowledged that there were chapters operating in Canada and in Australia, not necessarily affiliated with the American Proud Boys, but certainly sharing their ideologies. So when that terrorist entity designation was made in June 2022, it was big news. We hit headlines around the world for having made that designation. And what it would mean in practice was that anyone who supported or funded or who participated in Proud Boys actions here was committing a criminal act, imprisonable by up to 7 years. So it was a big deal.
It is a big deal. I want to talk in a moment about whether we have any that have been, recruited in New Zealand. But I want to go to this year because, as you mentioned, they'd been put away. They were in prison, one for more than 20 years. Trump gets elected. They're pardoned.
On his first day in office, he freed the rioters who stormed the Capitol.
So this is January 6th. These are the hostages. Approximately 1,500 for a pardon. Yes. Full pardon.
How huge was this, and what's the fallout been?
Yeah, it was a big deal, all right. I mean, there's been, you might not be surprised to hear, a pretty friendly relationship between Trump and the Proud Boys. They've been quite vocal supporters of Trump. They see him, some research described the Proud Boys as seeing Trump as kind of a strongman leader, which is one of the reasons they've fitted the definition of having a fascist outlook. And so when he decided to pardon or commute the sentences for many of those who had been imprisoned over that insurrection, it was huge news in the States. And obviously the leaders who had been pardoned or had their sentences commuted by Trump were very well disposed towards them. One of them described him as literally having given him his life back. But on that very same day that he was released, Enrique Tarrio led a march through Washington, D.C., where they were shouting the slogans that the Proud Boys are known for. And so observers think that those actions really have served to embolden the Proud Boys. There have been violent acts that they have been arrested for since.
Gosh, because I was watching a 60-minute piece and he seems quite open with threats of revenge. They're not happy.
Now he and his menacing Proud Boys
They made my family suffer.
are set to settle old scores.
And the people who made them suffer will pay.
They're not happy, and they have said precisely that those prosecutors who put them behind bars, they will be seeking revenge against them. And then on the 14th of June, there were, as you know, the massive No Kings demonstrations in various centres throughout the States. Well, the Proud Boys did their thing. They organised and they showed up en masse to counter those protests.
Go home! No one wants to be a Nazi! You're not even proud enough to be mad! Go home, Nazi scum! Go home, Nazi scum!
And there were arrests in multiple states across America involving Proud Boys members.
And then you come to New Zealand and our reaction seems to be we no longer classify them as a terrorist organisation. Have they sort of suddenly become less terrorist in the last 3 years?
Yeah, it's interesting timing because it was only 5 days after those arrests were made during the No Kings demonstrations of Proud Boys members that the designation expired in New Zealand. So the designation had been made under the Terrorism Suppression Act. And it means that every 3 years, under that act, every 3 years, that designation will expire unless the Prime Minister seeks to extend it. Now, I asked the Department of Prime Minister and Cabinet what had happened, whether there was any particular reason why that designation had not been extended. They didn't specifically answer that. Their response essentially said that the Proud Boys remain on the radar, that it is a serious designation to make under the Terrorism Suppression Act, and they need to be justified in doing so. And essentially that if any new information comes to hand, they will consider it.
So was there much fanfare when they didn't renew it, or was that just quietly just popped over somewhere where you happened to see it and find it?
There was no fanfare. It was gazetted. So literally on the website of the newspaper of the New Zealand government, the Gazette, it was noted, but it was a very short and rather bland statement, simply saying that the designation had expired. Nobody really talked about it. It was brought to my attention by somebody who has been monitoring the Proud Boys and this designation since it was made in 2022. And so that's when I decided to ask some questions. And part of the reason for that is that when the designation was made in 2022 and the police, as I said in their statement of case, said that there wasn't any evidence that the Proud Boys were operating in New Zealand, myself and my colleague Louisa Cleave looked at that then because we had reason to believe otherwise. Do you want to talk about
Yes.
that?
So why? What did you find out? What made you believe that there were people who were being influenced or bringing the Proud Boys here?
So we had been working with a researcher of the far right who had been compiling a dossier of people he believed had been sympathising and identifying with the Proud Boys for several years by then, going back to around 2019. They had been making posts on social media which were anti-Muslim and racist and misogynistic and were promoting gun culture. They had come up with their own New Zealand Proud Boys insignia. They would attend anti-immigration rallies wearing the distinctive black and yellow polo shirts of the Proud Boys that they wear in America. And they would post on social media in New Zealand quite openly at that stage, using the term uhuru, which is a Swahili word for freedom that they had co-opted, the Proud Boys, and they would photograph themselves doing the OK white power symbol, and they were reasonably open at that stage about it. But when we started to ask them about their actions and whether they were sympathisers or indeed members of the Proud Boys, they were dismissive. They said that they were just a group of friends, although they did admit that at their height, a leader had been in contact with the founder, Gavin McInnes, in the States. But they denied that they were doing anything other than getting together and drinking and going shooting and hanging out just as a bunch of mates, a fraternity. But we spoke at that stage to an author by the name of Andy Campbell, who had written a book called We Are Proud Boys, which he released in September 2022. And he said that was a common kind of tactic to just say that they were a fraternity, just a drinking club. But he cited the fact that they were using Proud Boys insignia, wearing the uniform, and using the terminology of the Proud Boys in the United States as being signifiers of the fact that that's what they appeared to be.
How concerned or worried were you when you started delving more and more into this and what you were finding, reading and hearing?
It was concerning to the extent that there was no attempt made to try to disguise their pretty extreme racism, Islamophobia in particular, that there was no real concern to try to pretend that they were anything other than those things, which was surprising to the extent that when the police made their statement of case, they called them crypto-fascists and said that the Proud Boys tried to kind of muddy their fascism in order to appeal to a broader and more normal or mainstream audience. But when we looked at it, they didn't really try to disguise that. And so I think it was concerning to far-right researchers who we were working with and talking to at the time, that while there had been no active criminal violence that was associated with any of these participants, certainly their concerning extremist views were laid bare.
Do you know where in New Zealand they based themselves or how many members there were in their group?
At that stage, we had evidence of 12. There may have been more. We had evidence of them operating in Auckland, the Bay of Plenty, Palmerston North, Christchurch, and Dunedin. The researcher that we worked with at the time said that after that reporting that we did in 2022, things went pretty quiet, but that, as they pointed out, doesn't necessarily mean they have changed their views. It's more likely just to mean that they have taken their views to a more protected, encrypted, private space.
Because are they deleting anything that they had out before? Are they scrubbing that all clean?
Yeah, it has been scrubbed clean, but without going too much into the methodology of those who monitor them, much of that had been captured, it had been screenshotted, and so, we hold those dossiers still. The evidence is clear. Fair to say that when we started approaching those individuals, they weren't best pleased to hear from us. A couple of them threatened legal action against us, but they did engage in conversations with us, and as I said, sort of sought to defend their actions as being nothing but a group of friends getting together.
And did you hand this to the police or alert the police, and what was their reaction?
We asked the police then, as we have again, about whether they're aware of any Proud Boys membership or participation, or whether there is anything that concerns them around Proud Boys members in New Zealand. Back then in 2022 and again now, they haven't responded directly to those questions. So we don't know. We didn't hand over that evidence to the police, no, but we don't know to what degree they have investigated or established for themselves this kind of activity, this kind of participation.
Now that they are no longer, classified as a terrorist organisation, do you think more will come out of the woodwork now? They'll have a confidence where they'll be like, actually, we can just go back to where we were back in 2022.
Well, this is the fear of some of the extremism researchers that we've been speaking to. Dr. Sanjana Hatatua says exactly that this lapsing, this expiry of the terrorist entity designation leaves a vacuum in which people who are inclined to associate, fund, participate, recruit for the Proud Boys can now do so without facing any legal consequence. So I guess that's part of the reason that we thought it was in the public interest to do this reporting, to put this information back out into the public consciousness, because if it is the case that they are emboldened by the fact that this expiry has happened, then people probably should be aware of that.
And are we prepared, if they start recruiting or radicalising people, and they have an event like Capitol Hill or something, are we prepared for anything similar here, do you think?
Well, I don't know. I mean, I would love to know, and I would love the authorities to answer that question. But every time we have tried to seek answers about the degree of knowledge and investigation into the Proud Boys in New Zealand, we haven't received any answers. So I don't know whether we're prepared for that. The difficulty, of course, is that, as I alluded to, the really meticulous and organised planning that in America the Proud Boys do when they're organising their presence at a demonstration or they're planning for their violence, is that it's done in private groups. It's done on platforms like Telegram, and it's difficult to monitor as a journalist, and it's difficult for authorities to monitor also. But yeah, the short answer is, I don't know how prepared we are for that.
On the flip side, obviously, did many other countries, if any, classify them as a terrorist organisation? Was it, I understand it was us and maybe Canada?
Australia did, and I'm not sure where that is at. Canada did, and that has not been reviewed since. Their terrorist entity designation in Canada was made in 2021. It hasn't been reviewed since, and so that one remains in place. It'll be interesting to see what does happen there when it does come up for review, whether that designation is extended or allowed to expire, as has been the case here.
Australia, of course, is where the far-right March 15th terrorist is from. In 2019, he opened fire in 2 mosques in Christchurch, killing 51 people.
Horror in Christchurch this afternoon after shootings at 2 mosques in the city. Those are Masjid Al Noor Mosque on Deans Avenue, that is right opposite Hagley Park, and at another mosque in Linwood. There are reports of multiple injuries and fatalities, with witnesses reporting seeing a man enter the mosque opposite Hagley Park dressed in a military jacket, and he just started shooting, they say.
One of the reasons that it was an important designation at the time was that it was only 3 years after the Christchurch massacre, and it was the first time that a right-wing extremist group had been given a terrorist entity designation in New Zealand. So it signalled a bit of a turning of the tide in terms of the understanding of our authorities of where the threats might lie. And so those who monitor terrorist organisations and far-right extremist groups really welcomed that decision. Those same people are really concerned at this step that the designation has been allowed to lapse.
Because we're not innocent anymore to that, are we? After what happened on March 15, it's been very real on our soil.
Yeah, and when you consider the fact that the OK white power symbol that the Christchurch shooter was known to use. He used it in court. That's the same symbol that members of the Proud Boys here, that we identified at least as being Proud Boys sympathisers in New Zealand, that's the same symbol that they use. And so that in itself, I think, sends quite a chilling message as to the sorts of sympathies that these people have.
That's all for today. The Detail is a newsroom production supported by RNZ and New Zealand On Air. Thank you to Paula Penfold. This episode was produced by Alexia Russell and engineered by Jeremy Ansell. I'm Amanda Gillies. Matua.